Hello, everybody. This is Stephen Whitfield with Drilling Contractor here from the 2022 IADC Contracts and Risk Management Conference in Houston, Texas. Joining me right now are Rick Kuebel and Phil Eisenberg, both partners at Locke. We're going to talk a little bit about bankruptcy, an exciting topic, but one that will be very fascinating for our viewers today. And gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. So, Rick, we'll start with you. One of the things that you guys discussed here at the conference was about the rash of bankruptcies that we've seen in the service sector over the last few years, and particularly after the downturn here. You had said that bankruptcies this time around were being used as a way to help companies sort of deleverage debt from their balance sheets. Can you explain how Chapter 11 bankruptcy does that?
Yes, I'm happy to. Typically, Chapter 11 bankruptcy is viewed as a restructuring, and there is the implementation of what's called an automatic stay. So when a company goes bankrupt, all of the collection efforts, lawsuits are stayed against it. They can't move forward. And the concept is that it gives the company a breathing space, a time to be able to reorganize its affairs and figure out how to pay its creditors back over time. And typically in that dynamic, the old owners, the owners of the business, stay in place, but they come up with a strategy or a plan of reorganization to pay their debts over time. What we saw with the drilling companies over the last 2.5 years or so after the pandemic was a little bit of a different dynamic, because the equity holders, the old equity owners, were effectively just poured out. The market was devalued through the pandemic and through pricing in such a way that there was a view that there was no longer value in the equity at all. So the equity moved out, and certain creditor constituencies, and generally they were financial creditors, generally what we call fulcrum creditors, often bondholders, occasionally secured creditors, used the bankruptcy process to become the new owners of the business. The old owners are out, they walk with little to nothing, and the old debt holders, the bondholders, the financial transaction counterparties step in as the new owners, but they take that debt off the balance sheet of the company. So it's purged, it's delevered, and those debt holders become the new owners of the company. And from a balance sheet perspective, the company has the assets it walked in with, generally speaking, the cash flow it walked in with, but without the debt.
So you had also said that this was sort of a new way of using bankruptcy to deleverage compared to what we've seen before. How so?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a new way per se, but it was something a little bit new and different in the energy service space. So typically, and unfortunately, the commodity business has brutal cycles, and every decade or few decades we see terrible cycles based on commodity pricing. And in many past cycles, bankruptcy was used more either to liquidate or close up the businesses, or to give breathing space where old equity stayed in place but paid off its creditors over time. And in this instance, the companies and their management structure stayed in place, but the ownership of the companies and their balance sheets are dramatically different.
Phil, you had something you wanted to add to that?
Sure. Not only is there a debt for equity restructuring, but most of the time when these Chapter 11s happen, it's because there's a liquidity crisis at the company. And so when the restructuring plan gets put into place, not only do you have to figure out who the new owners are based on the waterfall, but you have to figure out, how am I going to create cash to start to prime the pump to get new cash flows as the company gets restructured, as the expenses are cut, but the revenues are climbing. But that doesn't happen in one day. And so you have to pay your creditors, you have to pay your vendors going forward, you have to have new builds, you have to enter into new contracts. All of that needs fresh capital. And because it's a new balance sheet, they're able to raise that. And part of the plan is, how do you raise that new capital? And that's one of the things we've seen here. Either the new owners will put up the money, or they'll do a stock equity offering, or there's other combinations of how they do that. But that's one of the things that we've seen in this cycle as well.
What would you say are some of the key considerations that service companies, particularly drilling contractors, had to consider when they're looking at this deleveraging situation? What are the things that they had to think about?
Sure. Which part of the business is to keep? Okay. They had to analyze the profitability of the major contracts that they were undertaking, of the new contracts that they had coming up, and what direction they were going to take. And also in restructuring it, whether I'm going to sell off a piece of the company to create cash. That's another way to raise capital, is to do a sale of some of the assets. And so all of those are key considerations in these restructurings.
I guess lastly, I would ask, what would you say were some of the lessons learned that we take from all the bankruptcies that we saw in the service sector?
Be careful what you ask for, because sometimes you go into bankruptcy for one purpose, but because of the rules and the absolute priority and the leverage that certain debt structures have, and the fact that commodity prices are not, stable, they move up and down. You might have a hypothetical valuation, but the real valuations will affect the plan you had when you went in. And so the thoughts you had going in and the rationales that you had for going into bankruptcy in the first place may change over a 4, 5, 6 month period. And that's why you see a lot of these prepackaged plans try to do the restructuring really fast, so none of the assumptions that they had would change over time, because that could affect who gets what in a waterfall. So that's pretty important as well.
And Rick, what would you say are some lessons learned?
Well, bankruptcy is not a spectator sport. And if your contract counterparty goes into bankruptcy, you've got to pay careful attention to the bankruptcy from beginning to end to understand how your contracts, how your agreements are being treated. And if you're not careful, your rights can be totally disrupted if you don't protect your interests.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate having this insight into the bankruptcies that we've seen in the service sector in recent years, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot more to hear about as we see companies move forward. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for visiting Drilling Contractor.